The Arizona sun blazed down on the dusty town of Copper Creek in the summer of 1872, casting long shadows across the wooden boardwalks where townspeople hurried about their business. Samuel Garrett rode into town on his weathered Baymar, his clothes covered in trail dust from 3 weeks of driving cattle across the harsh desert landscape. At 34 years old, Samuel had earned a reputation as a fair man, someone who paid his debts and never started trouble he couldn't finish with words instead of bullets. He guided his horse toward the general store, thinking only of supplies and perhaps a hot meal before heading back to his small ranch 12 miles outside of town. The streets of Copper Creek bustled with activity that afternoon, miners fresh from the hills mixing with ranchers and shopkeepers in the familiar dance of frontier commerce. Samuel noticed immediately that something felt different about the town, a tension hanging in the air like the threat of a summer thunderstorm. Inside Miller's general store, Samuel found what he needed quickly: flour, coffee, ammunition, and a new rope to replace the one that had frayed during the cattle drive. As he waited for old Mr. Miller to tally his purchases, he heard raised voices coming from the alley behind the store, a female voice filled with distress. Samuel's instincts told him to mind his own business, but the tone was one that no decent man could ignore, so he left his supplies and walked toward the back door. What he saw in that alley made his blood run cold and his jaw clenched tight with immediate anger. 3 miners had cornered a young Apache woman against the back wall of the building, her dark eyes wide with fear, but her posture holding a dignity that struck Samuel even in that moment. One of the miners, a large man with a cruel smile, had grabbed the sleeve of her deerskin shirt and was laughing as his companions egged him on. The woman struggled to pull away, but the man's grip was too strong, and Samuel heard the fabric begin to tear under the pressure. Samuel stepped into the alley and called out in a voice that carried the weight of absolute authority, his hand resting firmly on the grip of his revolver. He told the men to step away from the woman immediately, making it clear he would not ask twice. The large miner turned with irritation and told Samuel to mind his own business, that this was just a savage and nobody would care what happened to her. Samuel felt his anger rise like bile in his throat, but he kept his voice steady as he informed the man he was making it his business. The miner released his grip on the woman's shirt, leaving it torn at the shoulder, then spat near Samuel's boots and muttered threats before leading his companions away. Samuel stood his ground until all 3 men had disappeared, then turned his attention to the Apache woman still pressed against the wall. He removed his jacket slowly, making sure she could see his peaceful intentions, and offered it to her to cover the tear in her garment. The woman hesitated for only a moment before accepting it, wrapping it around her shoulders with quiet grace that commanded respect. She introduced herself as Ayanna in perfect English, explaining she had come to town to trade herbs and medicines her people gathered from the mountains. Samuel told her his name and expressed his disgust at the miner's behavior, apologizing that she had encountered such cruelty in his town. Ayanna studied him with perceptive eyes, then grew serious as she explained that the large miner was Garrett Blackwood, a man known to her people for killing Apache. Samuel felt the weight of what he had done settle on his shoulders, knowing he had made a dangerous enemy, but he would make the same choice again. At the town's boundary, Ayanna paused and withdrew a small turquoise pendant shaped like a bear, pressing it into Samuel's palm as a symbol of protection. She told him to wear it always, that he had shown great kindness and her people would remember this debt. Then she disappeared into the desert landscape. That night Samuel stayed at the boarding house, his sleep uneasy and filled with dark premonitions that left him restless. He woke before dawn, dressed quickly, and decided to wear the pendant Ayanna had given him, tucking it beneath his shirt against his chest. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when Samuel heard the sound that would change his life forever, dozens of hoofbeats thundering toward town. He stepped onto the boardwalk and felt his heart freeze at the sight of Apache warriors coming over the ridge. their numbers seeming to fill the entire horizon. Samuel counted quickly and estimated at least 200 riders approaching with terrifying precision and purpose. The townspeople of Copper Creek erupted into panic, women screaming and men reaching for weapons in preparation for what they assumed was an attack. Sheriff Tom Wilson came running from his office, shouting orders that no one seemed to hear in their terror. The Apache warriors rode into town with remarkable discipline, their formation tight and their weapons visible but not raised in threat. At their head rode a warrior whose bearing marked him as a chief, his gray hair braided with feathers and his face painted with symbols of authority. The chief raised his hand and the entire column came to a halt in the center of Copper Creek's main street. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by nervous horses and whispered prayers of terrified townspeople. Sheriff Wilson stepped forward with shaking hand on his gun and demanded to know their purpose in a voice that cracked with fear. The Apache chief dismounted with fluid grace and announced they had come for the one called Samuel Garrett. Samuel felt his blood turn to ice as every eye in town turned toward him on the boardwalk. He took a deep breath, touched the pendant beneath his shirt, and stepped into the dusty street, walking toward what he believed was his execution. The chief watched Samuel's approach with an unreadable expression, his dark eyes missing nothing as the cowboy stopped before him. Then, to the shock of everyone watching, the chief's weathered face broke into a smile of genuine warmth. He stepped forward and placed both hands on Samuel's shoulders in a gesture of respect and profound gratitude. The chief announced to the townspeople that this man had shown great honor by protecting his daughter Ayanna from men who would have violated her. A murmur rippled through the crowd as the meaning of his words became clear, their fear transforming into amazement. The chief explained that when a man defends the honor of an Apache woman, he becomes a brother to the Apache people forever. He removed a magnificent eagle feather headdress and placed it upon Samuel's head, declaring him a friend and protector of the Apache nation. Warriors came forward carrying gifts of fine blankets and weapons crafted with extraordinary skill, presenting them with ceremony. The chief told Samuel that from this day forward, anyone who sought to harm him would answer to 200 warriors. Samuel was overwhelmed, his voice thick with emotion as he thanked the chief for this incredible and undeserved honor. He told the chief he had only done what any decent man should do, that Ayanna's dignity was worth protecting regardless of cost. The chief nodded slowly, his eyes showing deep approval, then turned to address the townspeople of Copper Creek directly. He declared that this town sheltered a man of true honor, and the Apache would remember this when considering their relations with white settlers. The chief then pointed toward the saloon where Garrett Blackwood and his companions stood watching with pale, terrified faces. He identified them as the men who had attacked his daughter and announced that justice demanded they answer for their actions. The chief declared he would leave their fate to Samuel, giving him the power of life and death over his enemies. Samuel looked at Blackwood, seeing fear where cruelty had once resided, and thought carefully about what justice truly meant. He told the chief he would prefer these men face the white man's law, that killing them would only perpetuate the cycle of violence between their peoples. The chief studied Samuel again, his expression showing surprise and increased respect at this display of wisdom and mercy. He agreed that mercy from a position of strength was the mark of a true warrior, then mounted his horse and raised his hand in farewell. The chief told Samuel to visit their lands whenever he wished, that he would always be welcomed as family among the Apache people. With a signal, the entire column of warriors turned as one and rode out of Copper Creek with the same discipline they had shown upon arrival. Samuel stood in the center of the street, still wearing the headdress, watching until the last warrior disappeared over the ridge. Sheriff Wilson approached and shook his hand firmly, thanking him for his courage and admitting he had expected bloodshed that morning. As Samuel rode back to his ranch, he thought about how a simple act of decency had changed everything, how seeing another person's humanity cost nothing but gave everything. In the years that followed, Samuel became known throughout the territory as a man who bridged two worlds, trading fairly and helping negotiate peace. The story of how 200 Apache warriors came to honor a single cowboy spread throughout the West, becoming a legend that reminded people everywhere that true courage lies not in facing death, but in facing what's right. Samuel kept the headdress and turquoise pendant for the rest of his life, treasures that reminded him that strength lies not in the power to harm, but in the courage to protect those whose dignity others would deny. Retry.